This is a session that a lot of you have been waiting for just because we know it's tough. It's a COVID year, which means fundraising is very hard. It was never easy to begin with, and it's even harder right now. So we thought this would be a great time to check in with the experts on this one. Bridget Gallagher is principal at Gallagher Group, where she helps companies figure out their fundraising journey, and it's always been a great source of advice when it comes to figuring out how to get the right investments at the right time and how to ask for grants. Caroline works at GIJN, and she's one of our wonderful partners in trying to make this community effort that we've got going. Thank you to the both of you, Caroline and Bridget. Let's go straight to you and your presentation.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan and Rashad. We're delighted to be here with you and with all SLICE participants worldwide. There's a great range of countries here. I'm Caroline Jarboe, and I'm Development Director for GIJN, as you heard. I have spent years now working in the trenches of fundraising for nonprofit media, mostly with foundations and individual donors. I've worked for National Public Radio and The Atlantic here in the United States, so I have worked for both for-profit and nonprofit, as well as the Center for Public Integrity, where I had the pleasure of working for Bridget. If you don't know GIJN's work, the Global Investigative Journalism Network is an international association of nonprofit organizations that supports training, capacity building, sharing of information among investigative and data journalists. Our mission is to spread, strengthen, and support in-depth accountability journalism to the global community of journalists, be it reporters, filmmakers, citizen journalists, NGO staff, and basically anyone who wants to use investigative tools to expose abuses of power and to tell the truth. GIJN has 184 members in 77 countries. We publish investigative resources in 8 languages a day to an audience of 300,000 journalists and other public watchdogs worldwide. We have online resources, access to training and experts, and we also host the Global Investigative Journalism Conference and the Asia Investigative Journalism Conference. And since the pandemic began, as many of you know, we've produced 45 webinars on aspects of investigating during the crisis that have been seen by approximately 33,000 people in 100 countries. I am so glad to be here with Bridget, who helped steer GIJN's fundraising prowess before I came aboard. Bridget, you want to tell us about yourself and get us kicked off?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us, for either ending your day with us or beginning your day with us, or wherever you are in your day. Thank you for being here. Caroline is one of my all-time favorite colleagues, and GIJN is one of my all-time favorite clients. So I really appreciate you guys letting me tag along in this, and thanks Alan and Rashad and Shirley for all the work you do organizing this. Really exciting to be here. I've been a fundraiser for 20 plus years. For about 15 of those, I have focused on nonprofit journalism and media. And for the last 10 of those, I've done that through my firm, Gallagher Group, LLC. So my clients range from folks like ICIJ and OCCRP and ARIJ, who are all part of the big FinCEN scoop that dropped yesterday. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, take a look at that. To Institute for Nonprofit News, some local news producers here in the States like Mississippi Today or iNewsSource out of San Diego. I worked with places like Internews, with Index on Censorship, with PBS. So it's been a wonderful learning opportunity for me over the last 15 years to see the way the conversation about funding journalism has changed, and to see the opportunities to bring new donors along to this. So I'm excited to chat with you all today about what's changed under COVID, what's kind of stayed the same, and how you can kind of keep afloat in these very uncertain times.
So this should be interesting being online, can we get a show of hands about how many of you actively fundraise or have fundraising experience? If so, could you put a number 1 in the chat box? Can we see? Put a number 1 in the chat box so we can see. Okay. Trying to get, we got lots of fundraisers here. Okay.
Yep.
Good deal.
Okay. Now, in 2 words, how does fundraising make you feel? Can you put a word or 2 in the chat box about? I know I've done this for 20 years. It's pretty nerve-wracking for me still.
Yeah, sometimes the emojis speak for themselves.
Yeah, what's the head exploding emoji or the vomit emoji? Well,
textbook. Well, you guys couldn't have set this up better for me. Whatever you're feeling, we're going to talk about the habits that you as a media entrepreneur can develop to make your pitches more effective in a pandemic and beyond. I'm just going to share some slides here. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Great.
No, yes.
Perfect. Here it
There we
comes.
go.
Very
Cool.
nice.
Outstanding. So on the one hand, you know, from my chair and kind of doing my job on a day-to-day basis, it feels like not a lot has changed under COVID. It feels like, you know, the kind of fundamentals of the way we do this work, the need to really commit to fundraising with discipline, with rigor, to think about it every day, to make sure you're, you know, moving a prospect along every single day. That feels very much the same. It feels like that sort of discipline is much more important. The rigor is much more important. At the same time, you know, we know the world has changed drastically. And I think what makes things more challenging, what makes things different is the fact that the competition is just so much fiercer. You know, people, I think donors feel like they have less money, they have less time, they're getting more requests. So I think that that's the reality that we have to acknowledge. And, you know, it really kind of delighted me to hear you guys say at the top of this, you know, be generous, be kind. I think that that's very much the attitude, which is a little bit different than the way we sometimes think about ourselves as fundraisers. You know, our role as fundraisers is not necessarily generosity. That's what we want from the philanthropists. But I think we have to realize that we're all navigating such a vastly different landscape and dealing with so many challenges, personal, professional, political, economic, that it just changes the dynamics of the conversations that we're trying to have with these donors. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I still think that at the end of the day, success in this field kind of comes from thinking of fundraising as a series of habits. It's not something that you can do occasionally. It's not something that sort of, you know, that last odd item on your to-do list that you get to if you have time for. Fundraising really needs to be the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning and the last thing you think about before you go to bed at night if you're going to have any success out there. And the urgency and the kind of challenges we're all facing just makes it that much more important that you really commit to it, but with that level of sort of belief and passion. So what I find, you know, when you're saying that fundraising makes you feel embarrassed or makes you feel anxious, this is certainly something that I have heard from my clients and all of the organizations that I've worked for in 20 years of doing this work. And I think the reason people feel that way about fundraising is, one, a general anxiety about talking about money, right? It's a subject that makes many people uncomfortable, kind of whatever side of the table you're on, if you're asking for it or if you're giving it out or if you're negotiating a salary. And to that, I would say, you know, think about how many solicitations you get, right? You know, it's less than 2 months away from an election here in the United States. When I opened up my inbox this morning at 5 a.m., you know, there were probably 100 solicitations from candidates and causes all across the country asking me to, you know, click here to give $5. So when you're thinking about this in a major gifts context, it's important to understand, you know, that foundation or that philanthropist is probably getting a similar amount of solicitations all the time. So you're not shocking them by reaching out and asking them for something. You're not shocking them and asking for a conversation about your organization and your work. So keep that in mind that, you know, people talk about philanthropy, people talk about giving, people ask all the time. I think the other thing that makes people uneasy about fundraising is this idea that it's a game you're playing whose rules you don't necessarily know. So I think it's helpful to talk about kind of the rules, right? These are some of the basic sort of fundamentals to understand going into a solicitation process. And that people give to people they know and people give because they are asked. It's important to know that, you know, you can't assume that a person who is reading your content, consuming your product, engaging or interacting with your work, they might not even know that you're a nonprofit, much less that you need money or what you need it for. So it's your job to go there and make the case, to convey to people what you need, why it's important to support this work. And if you can have those conversations, if you make those asks, people may give. But if you don't ask, you definitely won't get. There's no magic tricks in fundraising. There's no hack. There's no shortcut. A productive fundraising relationship is about rapport and trust. It's a relationship, like any other in your life, with a business partner, a colleague, a friend. There are rules that govern your expectations of those relationships. There's a sense of mutual benefit. The best fundraising relationships that you will have a really clear sense of that. The best conversations, and where you want to take these conversations with a prospective donor, is conveying that sense of benefit. What did they get out of a relationship with your organization? It's another, kind of, I think, mistake people make in kind of thinking about fundraising in your sort of headspace around it, is you think that it sort of weakens you to reach out and ask somebody for help, to ask somebody for financial support. And one, it's not, you're offering them the opportunity to be part of something really special that's making a difference in your community. And it's important to kind of enter these conversations and develop these conversations with that mindset. Like any other business proposition, this is an opportunity for someone to benefit from an engagement with your organization. So those are the rules. What are the habits? The first habit is preparation. And I tend to think that this is kind of the easiest, especially if you're a journalist. This is all about knowing your donors. So this is, research, fact-finding skills, doing a little bit of due diligence to kind of try to identify the prospective donors that are likely to invest in your work, and to figure out what makes them tick philanthropically. What are the things that you need to talk about to them to get to understand why an investment in your organization makes sense. Here in the US, we're lucky in that fundraisers like me are working in, the sort of philanthro-industrial, kind of complex, where we have a pretty rich and robust, set of databases to look at. It's a very transparent sector, so there's lots of information that we can find out, just from sitting at a computer. To the best of my knowledge, the Asian region doesn't have quite that degree of transparency. I flagged here the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, with a hat tip to Ross Settles, friend to all journalists,
Yes.
For turning me on to that. So that's one place where you can look at kind of trends and interests in philanthropy and among philanthropists in the region. When you're looking at something like the media grants map from media impact funders, which I think is sort of a great starting point for any prospect research effort. It's one of the best free resources out there. When you kind of pull up that map, what you'll still see are mostly Western donors, giving to Asian countries, right? So you're going to see Luminate, you're going to see Open Society Foundation, you'll see Ford Foundation, and kind of all the usual suspects. So the point that, it's very hard to find that database. And if anybody knows, by all means, drop it in the chat, share with us. I am not seeing a lot of data resources to find kind of Asian philanthropists supporting within the region. Wherever you are in the world, I think that the kind of desk research that I'm talking about is a fine starting point, but it can only take you so far. Where you're really going to find the kind of information that is helpful to you and that will kind of kickstart your major gifts efforts is in interrogating your network, right? Thinking about the stakeholders, the friends, the board members, the ambassadors that want to see your organization succeed, and kind of doing that 6 degrees of separation exercise. Who do they know? Who do they think you should be talking to? Who might they be able to make an introduction to? I think last week, Kevin Brockland from MDIF was kind of talking about this in the sort of investment firms context, and kind of made the same argument, right? The same philanthropic principle applies. Think about who you know. If you are going to pull a list out of a database and spend days and days finding good contact information and cold calling or cold emailing those people, that's like playing the lottery. That's not a strategy. Like, you might have some outcomes from something like that, but your success in doing that will rely on, getting lucky, finding the right contact in the right place at the right time. Whereas if you can kind of think about the connections in your own network and how you can leverage those, that's a far more effective strategy for getting in front of people in a more substantive way.
Bridget, I also wanted to jump in here and say, a lot of these resources you have here are geographically based, but if you are working your connections and the people you know already, look look at other affinity groups who are working at the kinds of issues you're working on already, like women's issues, LGBTQ issues, and looking at human rights funders who, what are their geographic interests in your areas, whatever this sort of specific kind of humanitarian issues you might be wanting to report on. Look at the other people who are supporting that. Look at lateral organizations who can give you kind of clues that'll help put you on the track to finding the funders you need.
100%. You know, I think it's really important to remember that we are all still on the steep end of the donor learning curve. So, you know, that universe of what I think of as capital J journalism funders, the folks that invest in journalism for its own sake, that, you know, love it, love to read it, love to see it produced. That's a really small universe, and it's uber competitive, right? It's like we all know all those names, the ones I just dropped. You know, you've heard from plenty of those people in the course of this session and any other conference you've gone to. You know, our job, I think, is to really grow the pie for journalism funding. And the only way we are going to do that is, you know, talking to people who care about climate, who care about gender and women's and girls issues, who care about violence prevention, who care about peace and security. Journalism advances all of those things. You know, my kind of fill in the blank argument is, if you care about X, you know, then you should support journalism about X. So I think that that's, you know, thinking about your values as an organization. What are the issues you want to cover? What are the communities you want to serve? What's a geographic focus? Thinking about all of those things will help you come up with actually, you know, better prospects. You know, don't just go to Luminate. Like, everybody does that. You know, Nishant hears from me all the time, and it's probably totally sick of me. So you know, think of some other people to talk to, and you'll probably have more rewarding conversations. And every one of those conversations that you have, you know, the question to ask is, who else should we be talking to about this? So I think, you know, it's important to take a really, you know, kind of creative, out of the box approach to thinking about your prospecting. So that's the preparation stage, right? Finding your donors, getting a sense of what makes them tick, and thinking about your relationship to that. And, you know, really in the presentation phase, what you're doing then is making the connection for them, right? This is where the rubber meets the road in the cultivation process. This is where you have the conversation to introduce yourself to a prospective donor. In the best of all possible worlds, you know, this is an in-person meeting where you have eye contact, you have body language, you have the opportunity to ask questions, listen to answers, you know, get your prospect talking, so that, again, you can really find out what motivates them, what gets them excited, and you can kind of tweak your own comments to respond to that and make it really clear what they get out of supporting your organization. In COVID, we're doing it this way a lot of the times, if you can get those meetings at all. I will tell you that, you know, I am seeing more donor fatigue earlier in the year than I ever have in my career. You know, people have been telling me for the last month, I'm tapped out. I'm not, you know, not doing any meetings until after Thanksgiving or after Christmas or after we know the outcome of the election. So it's harder to get people to part with their time. You might, you know, prepare for the fact that your introduction in this context is, you know, a 2-page organizational overview and case for support document, or a 5-slide pitch deck. Something that really, you know, whether it takes place in person or in writing, what you want to do is convey to a donor as a sort of introduction, you know, the sort of urgency, relevance, and uniqueness of your work, right? Why this? Why now? Why you? And how do you know it's working?
Yeah, and I actually think it's a great way to start out, you know, crafting your own pitch for meetings and for reaching out to people on email. You know, taking that personal inventory. Part of what you're doing, a lot of times in an American context, I'll use the word evangelism for your work, but you're also showing that you're a good person, the old ethos, good person reasoning well, figuring out all these answers to the question about what's the value proposition, what do you need to do, what are the resources involved, showing that you're really studied in how you've approached this. And then you can break it down to having the email pitch, the 1-page concept paper, which will end up being the backbone of a full proposal. But I always write it down no matter how much I know about a project. And it's part of my sort of enabling myself to be a better presenter.
Totally. I think that's a really smart strategy. I mean, I think, what I tend to find, because, we're all busy doing this work, is that a client will write up, they'll use whatever they wrote in response to the last RFP or proposal they did as sort of their document moving forward. And I think you lose that opportunity to really organically articulate what you're doing, why you're doing it, why it matters. I think you want to think about those things start to finish, articulate them in your own words, in your own way, so that, then it's easier when you have those RFPs that have specific questions that you have to adhere to. You can kind of cut and paste that. But I think that, kind of thorough start to finish articulation that makes sure you can emphasize the most important points for you is a really useful first step in any of this. And the other thing that I would say about kind of presentation, when you're having a phone conversation, when you're meeting, via Zoom or Google Meet, making sure that you take time to listen to that prospect is such an important part of this process. I frame it as presentation because it really is about kind of putting your best foot forward and using that opportunity to make a really dynamic first impression on a prospect. But I also, always caution clients going into meetings with a donor for the first time, don't go in there and spend the first 30 minutes talking about you. Mm-hmm. This, again, going back to the rules and a good relationship being about how the donor benefits, you need to give them space to kind of ask questions, tell you what they're interested in. This really needs to be, this is kind of an opportunity for you to basically like hold up a mirror to the donor so that they can, see themselves in it. Like then they really see themselves within your organization. They've already sort of gotten the value proposition. That makes it much easier to move the conversation to ask. And then, so the kind of final and most important and probably most difficult habit to develop is persistence. And this is because this is really the piece of it that you kind of have to do every day. Your moves management process is an ongoing activity. It's something that you have to think a little bit about every day. Who do I owe an email to? Who should I make that follow-up phone call to? Given all the other tasks you are probably doing running a journalism organization, it is, the most difficult to get a handle on, but it's the most important that you do this one, because this is what builds the relationship. This is what establishes rapport and helps a donor understand, in a dynamic way, your work, what your organization does, the impact that it has. So, to start, after you've had that introductory conversation, this is about just kind of following up. Thank them for the conversation. Thank them for their time. It's so hard to get that from people in this environment where we're all stretched so thin. So be really gracious, send that thank you note out no later than kind of 24 hours after that meeting or conversation. Acknowledge any sort of follow-up steps or additional information that you talked about in that conversation. Did you tell them you were going to send them a board list and an organizational budget? Did you tell them that you were going to send them a concept note? Do those things. Do whatever you said you were going to do so that they know that you're trustworthy, you follow through, you take notes, you are responsive. Don't be offended if you don't hear right back from somebody on those things. Everybody's busy. Everybody's getting a lot of these kinds of communications. So don't take it personally, give them some time, give them some space, maybe bump that same email up a week or so later. But, just don't let it fall off the radar either. It's on you to kind of remind this prospect that, you had a good introductory conversation or meeting. You've established some points of intersection, that, there's some synergy here where a working relationship makes sense. Here is some additional information. Here are the things to kind of keep them interesting. I tend to like to be in a prospect's email inbox every 4 to 6 weeks with something, something newsy, something interesting, not just a blast newsletter, but maybe I forward a client's newsletter with a note that sort of calls their attention to something that I think they might find interesting or useful, right? It's a way of making yourself useful to them. Again, in an environment where everybody's, super busy, to be able to call somebody's attention to something that you think they would benefit from, that you think they would find useful, is something that's really helpful. So, this is something that you need to make some time for. I find whether you're using a spreadsheet to track your moves management activities, or you're, putting a calendar reminder for yourself that, in 4 more weeks, you need to follow up with this prospect. make sure that you make a plan for yourself so that you can set yourself up to succeed, because it's easy to let this stuff get away from you if you don't stay on top of it.
And I'd actually just like to say one more thing, just that keeping relationships with people even after they reject you, or they say, I've had a funder say, we're never going to fund you. And then 3 years later, after I continued staying in their inbox and being friendly, I think all those kind of habits of grace and generosity will bear you well within the whole network you're trying to be established with.
Completely. Yeah. And I mean, and just in practical terms, if you are cultivating a foundation, for example, like like a MacArthur or a Ford, I mean, those budgets are set a year and change in advance. Those dockets are set months in advance. So sometimes, victory is keeping your organization kind of top of mind for that program officer, so that as they're making those plans, they remember to make room for you. If you've talked about a $300,000 grant, but they don't have room for that for another 18 months, you need to make sure that they don't forget about that, so that as they're making that budget, they put that $300K in there for you. And then I think I'll end kind of with the habits here, but there's some resources that you might find useful that are in this deck that I think will be posted later, and we can also talk a little bit about kind of the COVID context.
So COVID's made basically developing all these habits more important and more urgent than ever, and more difficult as we have to juggle more. How else do you think COVID's changed the funding environment, Bridget?
Sure. So I think the biggest change is what I was alluding to earlier, which is just that feeling of scarcity. And I think the interesting thing about it is it's a scarcity people feel not only of their money, but of their time. I'm just finding it so much harder to get those sort of, one-to-one introductory conversations in this quarter, because people feel like, like the basic message is, well, I'm not going to have any money to give you in this year anyway, so I just don't think a conversation right now is productive. Just like come back in January. And again, so this is a note that you make, right? Make sure you are in their inbox, after the holidays to remind them of that correspondence. But it also, I think, speaks to the need of leveraging those peer-to-peer connections. Thinking about who that can make an introduction, that can help you make that connection to a prospect. Because I do think that's sort of one way to kind of cut through this is if somebody that doesn't know you hears about you from someone they know and trust and respect, they basically, it's sort of a guarantee then that at a minimum, this won't be a waste of my time. This person that I respect thinks this work is great, and so I should at least find it interesting. Like, okay, I'll make the 30 minutes to have this introductory conversation. So I find that if you can really think creatively and leverage those sorts of connections, that's going to make a big difference for you.
And having a really sharpened sense of why your organization is particularly valuable now, how do you fit among your competitors? So it's a way for you to kind of sharpen your own ability to communicate your mission and what you're doing that's distinctive from others.
It's a really delicate time from a messaging perspective, right? Because on the one hand, we are competing with really acute humanitarian needs, right? There are really acute public health needs. People are in fairly desperate economic circumstances in many parts of the world as a result of this crisis. It's very easy, I think, for us to feel like journalism is sort of secondary or tertiary to that. That's kind of your knee-jerk reaction is, I'm not medicating people, I'm not researching a virus, I'm not giving food to people who have lost their jobs, so maybe that urgent. Talk yourself out of that. I think journalism is actually like first response to this. There is no way we get out of this that we are able to build back better without quality news and information. So all of the work that all of you guys are doing is so important in this moment. Don't miss the chance to make that case, right? Don't shy away from that. Because if you're not out there, somebody else is going to deliver that message and, just occupy that donor headspace. So you have to be in there making that case for that. At the same time, you have to balance that with a tremendous degree of humility, right? Because people are dealing with a lot. They're busy, they're tired, they're hurt. Everybody's really vulnerable right now. And I think on the one hand, that makes for interesting opportunities to have really candid conversations with a prospect that you might know that well. But you also just have to respect that, it just might not be a good time. And you have to, I think, be just considerate and tactful and polite and understanding about all of that. And there are some technical notes that I've put in here. Again, like I think this is something that you can kind of consult after the fact. This is an unprecedented disaster from a financial perspective. In the early days, the market was kind of up and down, and that was making donors feel really nervous. In most of the kind of big natural disasters, humanitarian catastrophes that we've seen in the past, donors have stepped up their giving. They actually give more in response to a crisis. They don't sort of cannibalize the causes that have long been important to them to give more money to the Red Cross, say. This is a little bit different in that, it's just sort of a crisis that hits on so many fronts and in so many parts of the world. People have sort of likened this to humanity, or Hurricane Katrina was a disaster of epic proportions in the United States. This is like Hurricane Katrina hitting every state every day for the last 6 months, right? So it's a scale that we've never had to grapple with before. But just technically, keep in mind, usually donors will dig deep and find the resources. When you're looking at institutional donors like foundations, they calculate their payout rate, the budget basically that they have to give away on a rolling average for the last couple of years. So those market jitters and things like that shouldn't affect what we see in foundation budgets too much moving forward. And also, the markets have rebounded beautifully. So, people might feel like they have less to give, but financially, their investments are, doing reasonably okay.
Another recommendation that I would have simply is that if you do receive specific dedicated funding now, I think you ought to be crafting what your pathway is when this ends or when we move on to the next phase. What's been made possible by the special support you've received now? How is this going to affect your work going forward? For example, GIJN has done all these webinars that we hadn't done before, and yet I can't imagine a world in which we just stop doing webinars. We now have a whole sort of additional suite of activities because of that. So this is a great other opportunity.
Yeah, I think virtual programming, virtual programming and that sort of content is totally here to stay. Thinking about, how this is an opportunity to help people engage with your content as they're at home, they're locked down, they're looking for answers, they're looking for content. I think all of that is, a case that's worth making, is sort of thinking about how it impacts your messaging and how you can use that as an excuse and an opportunity to really connect with people. Okay.
Right.
Outstanding.
Are we ready for questions?
There are a whole bunch of them here.
Delighted.
You've given everyone a lot to think about. Dee, why don't you go first? You've got 2 questions, I guess. If you can squeeze that in.
Great. Thanks for that, Bridget and Caroline. So my question is there an unspoken rule about how much of the percentage of the grant on offer we should ask? For example, it's 100,000. Do we ask for maximum 70,000? And is there a pros and cons to asking a little bit more than we need or a little bit less? Because if we ask for too little, they may think we're not serious. If we ask for too much, they think this person's just overpromising. Thanks.
That is a great question. So part of this is knowing your donor, right? And understanding what their capacity is. If this is a foundation or a philanthropist who has a pretty consistent track record, say, of giving $10,000 gifts and your budget is 100, then I would say that's not the first donor you talk to about this project, right? People like to be a part of something successful. There's the kind of rule of thumb if you're launching, say, a big fundraising campaign is you don't go public with it until you have 50% of it committed from a silent phase where you ask friends and family, existing donors for what you need. Because once you have more than 50% of your budget covered, then it's you can get started, people know it's going to succeed. There's minimal risk in it. So that's usually kind of what new donors are listening for is, if I give you this money, will it succeed? Will I be able to have a success story to tell my bosses or my board on the other side of this? So I think one, just knowing what's a typical dollar amount that donor usually supports and where does your project fall on that spectrum? Then I think it's fair to lay out, here's what we need to make this happen. And think about kind of what's your minimum viable proposition, right? If you need $100,000, but you only get 50, what can you do with that? Does that allow you to get started, or do you still need to fundraise for the other 50? And then maybe the question for them is, if that's what they come back with, could you help, could you introduce me to other people who might co-fund this with you?
So it's really
Caroline,
what
I
it comes
expect you have
down
some
to.
thoughts about that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it comes back to doing, it's going back to the preparation. So doing your research on what the actual resources are, but also a lot of it has to do with intuition and nuance. I mean, that's why the relationship is so incredibly important. I think one thing in the US that is and some of the global fundraising we do, that a lot of it is just, you have those conversations build on the relationship. So there are fewer open calls you're responding to. But I think the more you get to know a foundation, do your background research, but also get to know the principles of the people involved, you get a sense of when they speak of, what's an okay range. And then that's a point where, you need to really know your work and how much you need realistically. I mean, I know so many small groups that underball how much they realistically need, and haven't priced out all the components, or forget to take out overhead, or don't know the overhead policies of foundations. And I think just being educated and, doing that listening, and being really honest. I mean, it all goes back to the sort of, being a trustworthy person. And I think the more you get to know the foundations, you're able to communicate your vision, and that'll help you sort of set that point about the right size of a grant.
Dee is the founder of Plates Magazine, which is a food magazine. Coming up to
cool.
Oh,
well, we're off to go Google it right now.
That's right. I'm off to go subscribe, actually. I still haven't, Dee. Coming up to another founder friend of ours, a new friend of ours, Mariam Chaudhry is the founder of The Current in Lahore, Pakistan. Mariam, why don't you ask one of your 64 questions?
I do have a bunch. Hi, Bridget, Caroline. Thank you so much.
This is why we love you.
Okay, so just to kind of for myself specifically, just for like a background, we've been around for a year. I've had many people approach me to invest, and which has been lovely for me. And I actually had major organizations ask to merge as well. But my main concern has always been, I don't want anybody to have an editorial say in my content, which is something that I know eventually will pop up regardless of who wants to invest. So that kind of kicks out the people I might know or the network that I have within the country, because, so when I do kind of start looking outside of that, I still feel like having somebody that I know outside would definitely help. Like I was looking at Illuminate this morning during the presentation, and that's also, they pick the ones themselves who they do want to fund. So so there's like a 3-4 prong question. So in the email write-up that Caroline mentioned, how do I make that great for somebody to actually open that and read that and then tell me, oh, I want to fund this person that I don't know. And then, how do I sell myself, which I'm not really good at, actually talking about what I should be promoting. What do we need to promote in that for them to kind of get the attention of somebody who has no idea who I am? So yeah.
One thing, Bridget, I'm going to start off here if that's okay. Go back to your origin story. I love to talk about storytelling in seeking support, and again, be the evangelist for your work. What's your origin story? What's this tiny pithy example? Perhaps, the thing about an email is that you've only got, a couple of sentences max to get someone's attention. One thing, like to give a US example, I'm from the American South and I'm a white person from Mississippi. So I have a great knowledge of the real consequences of racism. And I can put that in one sentence, and it can be very powerful. It's also true. It can make me cry sitting here right here at my dining room table. Find whatever it is about your work or what you want to do with your new organization. I think holding the line on your editorial freedom is also really powerful. And you can, find that particular kernel that then later in a conversation can kind of blossom into other branches about why you need support.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I sort of think that your most powerful message at the end of the day, and whatever you say about your organization, your plans, your vision, what is it that gets you up in the morning to do this work, right? Like that is what you really want to convey to your prospective donor. That's why you want somebody to invest in you, is because they get that. If they get that, then you'll have a really rewarding kind of donor relationship with them, because they'll understand the importance of editorial independence and autonomy and all of that. And it just won't be as much of a struggle for you, I think. This is the other place where we need to do a ton of donor education, right? Donors who are not interested in investing in journalism, think, well, if I want a bunch of stories about, how how terrible like one state governor is on, you know, laws governing the behavior of LGBTQ people. You're like, can you do that? You know, and I've had investigative shops say like, that's just not the way we work. I mean, we can look broadly at policy, but like our job is not to like write hit pieces, you know, about a particular administration. Like if we go into this, our work will have no credibility. So there are definitely those conversations that you will probably come up against with a prospective donor. But I think at the end of the day, focus on that sort of through line, like what, at the end of the day, why are you doing this? This is such hard work. You know, why are you here? If you could do, you know, if you could do anything else, you would, because it can be that hard and that frustrating sometimes. But like this work means something to you. That's why you're here doing this. And so that's the story that you need to tell.
Right. And the social value from the things you've already produced. I mean, I think being able to iterate that, what have your stories done out there in the world, having that sense of impact, you know, how minds have changed. You can't always change laws. Obviously, that's the gold standard of impact, is when there's been policy changes. But knowledge on the ground is awfully good, really well, you know, it's good as well.
Yeah.
If I can add just one, sorry, guys.
Go for it, Mariam.
If I go like a website, who do I email from that list? Do I do the contact us? Do I find someone like a name? Like what's the designation that I need?
Great question.
Yeah.
Great question. So my general strategy on this, if it's a foundation where like I don't know, I mean, one is like, have I ever met anybody at this foundation anywhere? Like at a conference, I keep like a fat stack of business cards on my desk, and like when I'm totally out of my ideas, I will just like go through it, right? Like, have I met anybody here before? And if so, that's who I'll start with. If I've never met anybody from there, there are a couple ways to go about this. I generally try to aim for finding a good email address for the most kind of senior decision maker in the most relevant kind of like lane of programming, right? So if I'm pitching an environmental journalism project, I look for somebody that's in the like climate or environment portfolio at a foundation, like a vice president or like director title type person. Find an email address for that person, which is usually never as hard as you think it's going to be. It's like there are like 5 probably like email formats that are pretty commonly used. Like try all 5 of them if you really, you know, like conferences that publish like PDFs of their attendance lists, like from way back in the day, are just like a godsend, right? Because like,
oh my gosh, they're the best. You could like sit down with a glass of wine.
You're good until the end of time. It's great. Love that, right? So that's the first place I try. If that type of person doesn't exist or isn't obvious, I'll often look for like a communications VP. A lot of times those folks are former journalists, so they're at least kind of will know where you're coming from. A lot of, you know, in a number of American philanthropies, for example, it's kind of a trend that like the comms person is managing whatever journalism grant making they're doing because they don't have a formal journalism portfolio yet, but they are making enough investments that they have a staff member tasked with kind of making those decisions and doing that due diligence. So I will usually go there because they kind of like, they talk to all their colleagues. And so if they're not the right person to do it, they can kind of route it to somebody who's better poised to consider it. So if you're going in cold, those are the like couple of pathways that I use.
Yeah, and I would echo that.
I'm just waiting to see when Mariam's going to join in again. Jump in again. No.
I would, but no, I think, I mean, thank you.
If I could ask a very simple question, what does a good subject line look like in an introductory email?
Oh, that's a great question.
Oh, wow, you stumped me, Alan.
Yeah, I usually put the name of the, you know, like name of the organization that I'm pitching and like, you know, time to meet or like brief introductory conversation or something like question mark to make it clear, kind of like, here's what I'm talking about and here's what I'm asking you for.
A call to action, I think they refer to it. So yeah, organization call to action. Sometimes I'll put something like, you know, when I was at the Atlantic, putting something like criminal justice reform, question mark. Something that would, you know, they can't figure out what it is and just erase it until they look into the email body itself.
I mean, arguably that's clickbait, but you know, hey, there's a reason that works.
Right, and again, you know, it's
works.
your ethos. You don't just make it clickbait. You have actually something really good for them there that you believe in.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
Listen, I know Alan has a question for the greater community, but I just wanted to mention here that Bridget has kindly offered to be a mentor. She's offering some of her time. We're very grateful for that. Anybody who needs the advice of this incredible brain, please let us know. We'll put you guys in touch.
Right, and Rashad, I'm happy to do
Oh,
that
my
as well.
goodness.
I do that for
even better.
various organizations.
Alan, can we just
too.
sign up? I'm going to take you up on that. My goodness.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. That's very kind of
Totally.
you. Mariam's
Yeah,
going,
well, I always
yay!
learn so much from these conversations.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Sure.
It's like the most fun part of my job is doing
Yeah, totally.
mentoring on fundraising.
Oh, that is so awesome. Alan, you have an interesting question from.
So, well, I'd encourage other people to jump in with their questions before we wrap this up. But if I could do one question, it would be, we're trying to understand how to position ourselves. Again, like in this case, we're speaking as Splice now, right? We're trying to imagine where the mindsets of donors will be a year from now, right? So if this COVID situation continues for, obviously for the foreseeable future, where are their mindsets, and what do you think they would be thinking about in terms of prioritizing their budgets for next year?
I wish I had a crystal ball. If I knew the answer to that question, I would never have to work another day in my life. But and if there's one thing the last 6 months have taught me, it's that like everything is totally unpredictable. But I would say, I think at this point and moving forward, it's really important to kind of help elevate the sights of folks beyond the pandemic. Like, where, getting through the next, whatever it is, 6 months, 12 months, until like there's a vaccine, there's some sense of normalcy returning to things, is one thing. But this whole crisis has exposed some really profound, gaps in social safety nets, real systemic problems, systemic inequities. So we don't want things to just go back to normal, because normal was already really broken. So what are we building back better? What are we doing to make things better than they were before? What are we learning from this? So I think to whatever extent you can kind of engage donors in those conversations, and I think just make it clear that you don't have the answers, but like, here are some of the things we've learned in the last 6 months, and here's what we're trying to do. Here's how we've pivoted, and here's what we're trying to continue to iterate moving forward. I think just conveying some sense of dynamism, and that we're still in this. It's not like there are some people who, kind of like want to claim that this is like the worst is behind us and we're past this and we're just plugging away. But we all know that that's not really the case. So I think it's what can you say that really helps people understand that you're at least trying to get to someplace better, and you need help and you need input. I think, again, like the opportunity to sort of be vulnerable and talk about what you're testing out, what you don't know, what you're experimenting with, is actually really powerful. I think it's just opened up the opportunity for more candid conversations, where normally as organizations, we'd be really obsessed with sort of putting our best face forward to a funder and only talking about success. I think we have the opportunity to have a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, I would say
amazing.
Two words I would say is just planning and prudence. That it gives you an opportunity to talk about planning for the future. I think we're in some sort of, at least in the United States, it feels like we're part of a huge sea change. And I think doing our work, working with funders is part of it. Just being very measured, thinking ahead 3 to 5 years, knowing your stuff, I think will enable you to show that you're a good steward of what you're doing.
And I think like this is my sort of favorite kind of like cultivation trick is, the sort of hewing to the fundraising trope, like if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. Like, I think these are great opportunities to do this sort of, here's what we're thinking about doing in the next 18 months. Like, what do you think about that? What are we missing? Like asking for their input at this point. Yeah, it's just like this kind of sneaky backdoor cultivation strategy. And it does actually surface some legitimately interesting insights and ideas, and I think is worth doing in its own right. But then it's sort of like, hey, do you remember that, like, you gave me such awesome feedback on this concept as we were developing like our 18-month strategic plan. Now we need $500,000 to implement that. Like we took all your advice. What do you think about that? So I think this is the for those types of conversations.
Yeah.
Listen,
definitely.
I'm noticing that the Mariams on this call ask the best questions. This time I'm going to Mariam Rodia. Mariam, please go loud and ask your question.
Hi, Bridget and Caroline. My question is, does donor prefer to fund media organization under foundation or NGO form compare with the media under the corporate form? I'm from Hukum Online.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Cool. It is a great question. I think there's a lot more flexibility around that now than there was 5 or 10 years ago. You will definitely bump up against foundations, say, that are incorporated in the United States that have to give to nonprofit organizations. So it can create a little bit more logistical work to do to find a workaround for that. But even that is not that hard. You know, there are groups like Charities Aid Foundation, which, you know, basically is a mechanism by which an American donor can give to an organization any other place in the world, and their contribution can still be deductible under US tax law. So there are those places. There are, you know, kind of like Tides Foundation, for example, that, I mean, does kind of the same thing. So that you basically would need to engage, if you yourself are not a nonprofit, you need to engage some sort of intermediary so that a donor in the UK or US or Canada could still get the tax benefit and kind of meet the technical requirements of making a charitable contribution. But beyond that, people are a lot more flexible in sort of understanding that in other parts of the world, maybe a journalism organization can't be a nonprofit organization, or just as a business incorporation strategy, that just doesn't make sense for you. So I think if you're kind of clear in talking to those prospectives about what how you're incorporated and why that's the case, kind of what's the strategy behind that. It's not an insurmountable obstacle. I think you can kind of be either kind of entity and be just fine in your conversations with donors.
Yeah. Not at all. I mean, in the United States, you can get a fiscal sponsor who can help manage the donation for you. And I'm sure that there are similar structures elsewhere. It's just knowing why you are the structure you are and having a sense of what the governance and tax laws around those are.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. What an amazing session. Thank you so much for your time, Bridget and Caroline. I think this knowledge, well, I know I'll be looking through the transcripts on this one again, because I think there's just so much knowledge in there. And for those of you who would love to get more time with Caroline and Bridget, please drop us an email at hey@splicemedia.com, and we'll set you up with a mentorship session. So from Rashad and I, thank you so much. Oh, before we go, we also want to say, check out the resources page, splicemedia.com/resources. We will have the replay of this video in there, also with a very simple summary that you can take and use down the line. So once again, thank you for everyone's time. It's been wonderful, and we will see everyone tomorrow.
We should do this more often. This has been wonderful. Caroline,
let's do it again.
You are so fun to hang out with. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Dan Koch, for making this happen. Thank you, GIJN.
GIJN. Yes, my goodness.
Indeed.
Woo, thank you.